Chapter 27. The wealth of empires lay beyond the black door. Bright yellow coins, gold beyond counting, lay in heaps on the floor. Carelessly scattered among the coins were rings, bracelets, chains, and crowns, gleaming richly. Blood-red bars from the mines of Angarak stood in stacks along the wall, interspersed here and there by open chests filled to overflowing with fist-sized diamonds that glittered like ice. A large table sat in the center of the room, littered with rubies, sapphires, and emeralds as big as eggs. Ropes and strings of pearl, pink, rose-gray, and even some of jet held back the deep crimson drapes that billowed heavily before the windows. Belgrath moved like a stalking animal, showing no sign of his age, his eyes everywhere. He ignored the riches around him and crossed the deep carpeted floor to a room filled with learning, where tightly rolled scrolls lay in racks reaching to the ceiling, and the leather backs of books marched like battalions along dark wooden shelves. The tables in the second room were covered with the curious glass apparatus of chemical experiments and strange machines of brass and iron, all cogs and wheels and pulleys and chains. In yet a third chamber stood a massive gold throne backed by drapes of black velvet. An ermine cape lay across one arm of the throne, and a scepter and a heavy gold crown lay upon the seat. Inlaid in the polished stone of the floor was a map that depicted, so far as Garion could tell, the entire world. "What sort of place is this?" Dernick whispered in awe. "Tuchik amuses himself here," Aunt Paul replied with an expression of repugnance. "He has many vices, and he likes to keep each one separate." "He's not down here," Belgrath muttered. "Let's go up to the next level." He led them back the way they had come, and started up a flight of stone steps that curved along the rounded wall of the turret. The room at the top of the stairs was filled with horror. A rack stood in the center of it, and whips and flails hung on the walls. Cruel implements of gleaming steel lay in orderly rows on a table near the walls. Hooks, needle-pointed spikes, and dreadful things with saw edges that still had bits of bone and flesh caught between their teeth. The entire room reeked of blood. "You and Silk go ahead, Father," Aunt Paul said. "There are things in the other rooms on this level that Garion, Dernick, and Relg shouldn't see." Belgrath nodded, and went through a doorway with Silk behind him. After a few moments they returned by way of another door. Silk's face looked slightly sick. "He has some rather exotic perversions, doesn't he?" he remarked with a shudder. Belgrath's face was bleak. "We go up again," he said quietly. "He's on the top level. I thought he might be, but I needed to be sure." They mounted another stairway. As they neared the top, Garion felt a peculiar tingling glow beginning somewhere deep within him, and a sort of endless singing seemed to draw him on. The mark on the palm of his right hand burned. A black stone altar stood in the first room on the top level of the turret, and a steel image of the face of Torak brooded from the wall behind it. A gleaming knife, its hilt crusted with dried blood, lay on the altar. The bloodstains had sunk into the very pores of the rock. Belgarath was moving quickly now, his face intent and his stride cat-like. He glanced through one door in the wall beyond the altar, shook his head, and moved on to a closed door in the far wall. He touched his fingers lightly to the wood, then nodded. "He's in here," he muttered with satisfaction. He drew in a deep breath, and grinned suddenly. "I've been waiting for this for a long time," he said. "Don't dawdle, Father," Aunt Paul told him impatiently. Her eyes were steely, and the white lock at her brow glittered like frost. "I want you to stay out of it when we get inside, Paul," he reminded her. "You too, Garion. This is between Tuchik and me." "All right, Father," Aunt Paul replied. Belgrath put out his hand and opened the door. The room beyond was plain, even bare. The stone floor was uncarpeted, and the round windows looked out into darkness were undraped. Simple candles burned in sconces on the wall, and a plain table stood in the center of the room. Seated at the table with his back to the door sat a man in a hooded black robe, who seemed to be gazing into an iron cask. Garion felt his entire body throbbing in response to what was in the cask, and the singing in his mind filled him. A little boy with pale blonde hair stood in front of the table, and he was also staring at the cask. He wore a smudged linen smock and dirty little shoes. Though his expression seemed devoid of all thought, there was a sweet innocence about him that caught at the heart. His eyes were blue, large, and trusting, and he was quite the most beautiful child Garion had ever seen. "What took you so long, Belgarath?" the man at the table asked, not even bothering to turn around. His voice sounded dusty. He closed the iron box with a faint click. "I was almost beginning to worry about you." "A few minor delays, Tuchik," Belgarath replied. "I hope we didn't keep you waiting too long." "I managed to keep myself occupied. Come in, all of you." Tuchik turned to look at them. His hair and beard were a yellowed white and were very long. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes glittered in their sockets. It was a face filled with an ancient and profound evil. Cruelty and arrogance had eroded all traces of decency or humanity from it, and a towering egotism had twisted it into a perpetual sneer of contempt for every other living thing. His eyes shifted to Aunt Paul. "Polgara," he greeted her with a mocking inclination of his head. "You're as lovely as ever. Have you come finally to submit yourself to the will of my master?" His leer was vile. "No, Tuchik," she replied coldly. "I came to see justice." "Justice!" he laughed scornfully. "There's no such thing, Polgara. The strong do what they like. The weak submit. My master taught me that. And his maimed face did not teach you otherwise." The high priest's face darkened briefly, but he shrugged off his momentary irritation. "I'd offer you all a place to sit and some refreshment, perhaps," he continued in that same dusty voice. "But you won't be staying that long, I'm afraid." He glanced at the rest of them, his eyes noting each in turn. "Your party seems diminished, Belgarath," he observed. "I hope you haven't lost any of them along the way." "They're all well, Tuchik," Belgarath assured him. "I'm certain they'll appreciate your concern, however." "All," Tuchik drawled. "I see the nimble thief and the man with 2 lives and a blind man, but I don't see the others. Where's the dreadful bear and the night protector, the horse lord and the bowmen, and the ladies? Where are they, the queen of the world and the mother of the race that died?" "All well, Tuchik," Belgarath replied. "All well." "How extraordinary. I was almost certain that you'd have lost 1 or 2 at least by now. I admire your dedication, old man, to keep intact for all these centuries a prophecy that would have collapsed if one single ancestor had died at the wrong time." His eyes grew distant momentarily. "Ah," he said, "I see. You left them below to stand guard." "You didn't have to do that, Belgarath. I left orders that we weren't to be disturbed." The high priest's eyes stopped then on Garion's face. "Belgarian," he said almost politely. Despite the singing that still thrilled in his veins, Garion felt a chill as the evil force of the high priest's mind touched him. "You're younger than I expected." Garion stared defiantly at him, gathered his will to ward off any surprise move by the old man at the table. "Would you pit your will against mine, Belgarian?" Tuchik seemed amused. "You burned Chamdar, but he was a fool. You'll find me a bit more difficult. Tell me, boy, did you enjoy it?" "No," Garion replied, still holding himself ready. "In time you'll learn to enjoy it," Tuchik said with an evil grin. "Watching your enemy writhe and shriek in your mind's grip is one of the more satisfying rewards of power." He turned his eyes back to Belgarath. "And so you've come at last to destroy me," he said mockingly. "If it comes down to that, yes. It's been a long time coming, Tuchik. Hasn't it, though? We're very much alike, Belgarath. I've been looking forward to this meeting almost as much as you have. Yes, we're very much alike. Under different circumstances, we might even have been friends." "I doubt that. I'm a simple man, and some of your amusements are a bit sophisticated for my taste." "Spare me that, please. You know as well as I do that we're both beyond all restriction." "Perhaps, but I prefer to choose my friends a bit more carefully." "You're growing tiresome, Belgarath. Tell the others to come up." Tuchik raised one eyebrow sardonically. "Don't you want to have them watch while you destroy me? Think of how sweet their admiration will be." "They're fine just where they are," Belgarath told him. "Don't be tedious. Surely you're not going to deny me the opportunity to pay homage to the Queen of the World." Tuchik's voice was mocking. "I yearn to behold her exquisite perfection before you kill me." I doubt that she'd care much for you, Tuchik. I'll convey your respects, however. I insist, Belgarath. It's a small request, easily granted. If you don't summon her, I will. Belgarath's eyes narrowed, and then he suddenly grinned. So that's it, he said softly. I wondered why you'd gone to all the trouble to let us get through so easily. It doesn't really matter now, you know, Tuchik almost purred. You've made your last mistake, old man. You've brought her to Rakthal, and that's all I really needed. Your prophecy dies here and now, Belgarath, and you with it, I'd imagine. The high priest's eyes flashed triumphantly, and Garion felt the evil force of Tuchik's mind reaching out, searching with a terrible purpose. Belgarath exchanged a quick look with Aunt Paul, and slyly winked. Tuchik's eyes widened suddenly as his mind swept over the lower levels of his grim turret and found it empty. "Where is she?" he demanded wildly in a voice that was almost a scream. "The princess wasn't able to come with us," Belgarath replied blandly. "She sends her apologies, though." "You're lying, Belgarath! You wouldn't have dared to leave her behind! There's no place in the world where she'd be safe!" "Not even in the caves of Ulgo?" Tuchik's face blanched. "Ulgo?" he gasped. "Poor old Tuchik," Belgarath said, shaking his head in mock regret. "You're slipping badly, I'm afraid. It wasn't a bad plan you had, but didn't it occur to you to make sure that the princess was actually with us before you let me get this close to you?" "One of the others will do just as well," Tuchik asserted, his eyes blazing with fury. "No," Belgarath disagreed. "The others are all unassailable. Sinedra is the only vulnerable one, and she's at Prolgu, under the protection of Ul himself. You can attempt that if you'd like, but I wouldn't really advise it." "Curse you, Belgarath!" "Why don't you just give me the orb now, Tuchik?" Belgarath suggested. "You know I can take it away from you if I have to." Tuchik struggled to gain control of himself. "Let's not be hasty, Belgarath," he said after a moment. "What are we going to gain by destroying each other? We have Thrag Yaska in our possession. We could divide the world between us." "I don't want half the world, Tuchik." "You want it all for yourself?" A brief knowing smile crossed Tuchik's face. "So did I, at first, but I'll settle for half. Actually, I don't want any of it." Tuchik's expression became a bit desperate. "What do you want, Belgarath?" "The orb," Belgarath replied inexorably. "Give it to me, Tuchik." "Why don't we join forces and use the orb to destroy Zadar?" "Why?" "You hate him as much as I do. He betrayed your master. He stole Thrag Yaska from you." "He betrayed himself, Tuchik, and I think that haunts him sometimes. His plan to steal the orb was clever, though." Belgarath looked thoughtfully at the little boy standing in front of the table, his large eyes fixed on the iron cask. "I wonder where he found this child," he mused. "Innocence and purity are not exactly the same thing, of course, but they're very close. It must have cost Zadar a great deal of effort to raise a total innocent. Think of all the impulses he had to suppress." "That's why I let him do it," Tuchik said. The little blond boy, seeming to know that they were discussing him, looked at the two old men, his eyes filled with absolute trust. "The whole point is I still have Thrag Yaska, the orb," Tuchik said, leaning back in his chair and laying one hand on the cask. "If you try to take it, I'll fight you. Neither of us knows for sure how that would turn out. Why take chances? What good is it doing you? Even if it would submit to you, what then? Would you raise Torak and surrender it to him?" "I might think about it, but Torak's been asleep for 5 centuries now, and the world's run fairly well without him. I don't imagine there's all that much point in disturbing him just yet." "Which would leave you in possession of the orb." Tuchik shrugged. "Someone has to have it. Why not me?" He was still leaning back in his chair, seeming almost completely at ease. There was no warning movement, or even a flicker of emotion across his face as he struck. It came so quickly that it was not a surge, but a blow. And the sound of it was not the now familiar roaring in the mind, but a thunderclap. Garion knew that had it been directed at him, it would have destroyed him. But it was not directed at him. It lashed instead at Belgarath. For a dreadful instant, Garion saw his grandfather engulfed in a shadow blacker than night itself. Then the shadow shattered like a goblet of delicate crystal, scattered shards of darkness as it blew apart. Now grim-faced, Belgrath still faced his ancient enemy. "Is that the best you can do, Tuchik?" he asked, even as his own will struck. A searing blue light suddenly surrounded the Grolem, closing in upon him, seeming to crush him with its intensity. The stout chair upon which he sat burst into chunks and splinters, as if a sudden vast weight had settled down upon it. Tuchik fell among the fragments of his chair and pushed back the blue incandescence with both hands. He lurched to his feet and answered with flames. For a dreadful instant, Garion remembered Asherak burning in the Wood of the Dryads, but Belgrath brushed the fire away. Despite his once stated assertion that the will of the word needed no gesture, he raised his hand and smashed at Tuchik with lightning. The sorcerer and the magician faced each other in the center of the room, surrounded by blazing lights and waves of flame and darkness. Garion's mind grew numb under the repeated detonations of raw energy as the two struggled. He sensed that their battle was only partially visible, and that blows were being struck which he could not see, could not even imagine. The air in the turret room seemed to crackle and hiss. Strange images appeared and vanished, flickering at the extreme limits of visibility, vast faces, enormous hands, and things Garion could not name. The turret itself trembled as the two dreadful old men ripped apart the fabric of reality itself to grasp weapons of imagination or delusion. Without even thinking, Garion began to gather his will, drawing his mind into focus. He had to stop it. The edges of the blows were smashing at him, at the others. Beyond thought now, Belgrath and Tuchik, consumed with their hatred for each other, were unleashing forces that could kill them all. "Garion, stay out of it!" Montpal told him in a voice so harsh he could not believe it was hers. "They're at their limit. If you throw anything else into it, you'll destroy them both." She gestured sharply to the others. "Get back, all of you! The air around them is alive!" Fearfully, they all backed toward the rear wall of the turret room. The sorcerer and the magician stood no more than a few feet apart now, their eyes blazing, and their power surging back and forth in waves. The air sizzled around them, and their robes smoked. Then Garion's eyes fell upon the little boy. He stood watching with calm, uncomprehending eyes. He neither started nor flinched at the dreadful sounds and sights that crashed around him. Garion tensed himself to dash forward and yank the child to safety, but at that moment the little boy turned toward the table. Quite calmly, he walked through a sudden wall of green flame that shot up in front of him. Either he did not see the fire, or did not fear it. He reached the table, stood on his tiptoes, and raising the lid, he put his hand into the iron cask, over which Tuchik had been gloating. He lifted a round, polished, gray stone out of the cask. Garion instantly felt that strange tingling glow again, so strong now that it was almost overwhelming, and his ears filled with the haunting song. He heard Aunt Poll gasp. Holding the gray stone in both hands like a ball, the little boy turned and walked directly toward Garion, his eyes filled with trust, and the expression on his small face confident. The polished stone reflected the flashing lights of the terrible conflict raging in the center of the room. But there was another light within it as well. Deep within it stood an intense azure glow. A light that neither flickered nor changed, a light that grew steadily stronger as the boy approached Garion. The child stopped and raised the stone in his hands, offering it to Garion. He smiled and spoke a single word. "Errand." An instant image filled Garion's mind, an image of a dreadful fear. He knew that he was looking directly into the mind of Tuchik. There was a picture in Tuchik's mind, a picture of Garion holding the glowing stone in his hand. And that picture terrified the Grolem. Garion felt waves of fear spilling out toward him. Deliberately, and quite slowly, he reached his right hand toward the stone the child was offering. The mark on his palm yearned toward the stone, and the chorus of song in his mind swelled to a mighty crescendo. Even as he stretched out his hand, he felt the sudden, unthinking animal panic in Tuchik. The Grolem's voice was a hoarse shriek. "Be not!" he cried out desperately, directing all his terrible power at the stone in the little boy's hands. For a shocking instant, a deadly silence filled the turret. Even Belgrath's face, drawn by his terrible struggle, was shocked and unbelieving. The blue glow within the heart of the stone seemed to contract, then it flared again. Tuchik, his long hair and beard disheveled, stood gaping in wide-eyed and open-mouthed horror. I didn't mean it, he howled. I didn't, But a new and even more stupendous force had already entered the round room. The force flashed no light, nor did it push against Garion's mind. It seemed instead to pull out, drawing at him as it closed about the horrified Tuchik. The high priest of the Grolums shrieked mindlessly. Then he seemed to expand, then contract, then expand again. Cracks appeared on his face as if he had suddenly solidified into stone, and the stone were disintegrating under the awful force welling up within him. Within those hideous cracks, Garion saw not flesh and blood and bone, but blazing energy. Tuchik began to glow brighter and brighter. He raised his hands imploringly. "Help me!" he screamed. He shrieked out a long, despairing, "No!" And then, with a shattering sound that was beyond noise, the disciple of Torak exploded into nothingness. Hurled to the floor by the awesome blast, Garion tumbled against the wall. Without thinking, he caught the little boy, who was flung against him like a rag doll. The round stone clattered as it bounced against the rocks of the wall. Garion reached out to catch it, but Aunt Paul's hand closed on his wrist. "No," she told him. "Don't touch it! It's the orb!" Garion's hand froze. The little boy squirmed out of his grasp and ran after the rolling orb. "Errand!" he laughed triumphantly as he caught it. "What happened?" Silk muttered, struggling to his feet and shaking his head. "Tuchik destroyed himself," Aunt Paul replied, also rising. "He tried to unmake the orb. The Mother of the Gods will not permit unmaking." She looked quickly at Garion. "Help me with your grandfather." Belgarath had been standing almost in the center of the explosion that had destroyed Tuchik. The blast had thrown him halfway across the room, and he lay in a stunned heap, his eyes glazed and his hair and beard singed. "Get up, father," Aunt Paul said urgently, bending over him. The turret began to shudder, and the basalt pinnacle from which it hung swayed. A vast booming sound echoed up out of the earth. Bits of rock and mortar showered down from the walls of the room as the earth quivered in the aftershock of Tuchik's destruction. In the rooms below, the stout door banged open, and Garion heard pounding feet. "Where are you?" Barrack's voice bellowed. "Up here!" Silk shouted down the stairway. Barrack and Mandaron rushed up the stone stairs. "Get out of here!" Barrack roared. "The turret's starting to break away from the rock! The temple up there is collapsing, and there's a crack 2 feet wide in the ceiling where the turret joins the rock!" "Father," Aunt Paul said sharply, "you must get up!" Belgarath stared at her uncomprehendingly. "Pick him up," she snapped at Barrack. There was a dreadful tearing sound as the rocks that held the turret against the side of the peak began to rip away under the pressures of the convulsing earth. "There!" Relg said in a ringing voice. He was pointing at the back wall of the turret where the stones were cracking and shattering. "Can you open it? There's a cave beyond." Aunt Paul looked up quickly, focused her eyes on the wall, and pointed one finger. "Burst!" she commanded. The stone wall blew back into the echoing cave like a wall of straw struck by a hurricane. "It's pulling loose!" Silk yelled, his voice shrill. He pointed at a widening crack between the turret and the solid face of the rock. "Jump!" Barrack shouted. "Hurry!" Silk flung himself across the crack and spun to catch Relg, who had followed him blindly. Dernick and Mandaron, with Aunt Paul between them, leaped across as the groaning crack yawned wider. "Go, boy!" Barrack commanded Garion, carrying the still dazed Belgarath. The big Cherik was lumbering toward the opening. "The child!" The voice in Garion's mind crackled, no longer dry or disinterested. "Save the child, or everything that has ever happened is meaningless." Garion gasped, suddenly remembering the little boy. He turned and ran back into the slowly toppling turret. He swept up the boy in his arms and ran for the hole Aunt Paul had blown in the rock. Barrack jumped across, and his feet scrambled for an awful second on the very edge of the far side. Even as he ran, Garion pulled in his strength. At the instant he jumped, he pushed back with every ounce of his will. With the little boy in his arms, he literally flew across the awful gap and crashed directly into Barrick's broad back. The little boy in his arms, with the orb of Alder cradled protectively against his chest, smiled up at him. "Errand?" he asked. Garion turned. The turret was leaning far out from the basalt wall, its supporting stones cracking, ripping away from the sheer face. Ponderously it toppled outward, and then, with the shards and fragments of the Temple of Torak hurtling past it, it sheared free of the wall and fell into the awful gulf beneath. The floor of the cave they had entered was heaving as the earth shuddered, and shock after shock reverberated up through the basalt pinnacle. Huge chunks of the walls of Rakthal were ripping free and plunging past the cave mouth, flickering down through the red light of the newly risen sun. "Is everybody here?" Silk demanded, looking quickly around. Then, satisfied that they were all safe, he added, "We'd better get back from the opening a bit. This part of the peak doesn't feel all that stable." "Do you want to go down now?" Relg asked Aunt Paul, "or do you want to wait until the shaking subsides?" "We'd better move," Barrick advised. "These caves will be swarming with Murgos as soon as the quake stops." Aunt Paul glanced at the half-conscious Belgraph and then seemed to gather herself. "We'll go down," she decided firmly. "We still have to stop to pick up the slave woman." "She's almost certain to be dead," Relg asserted quickly. "Earthquakes probably brought the roof of that cave down on her." Aunt Paul's eyes were flinty as she looked at him full in the face. No man alive could face that gaze for long. Relg dropped his eyes. "All right," he said sullenly. He turned and led them back into the dark cave, with the earthquake rumbling beneath their feet.